Welcome to episode 6 of The Evidence Room. Inside every investigation, the truth is hidden in the evidence. Tonight, we explore one of the United Kingdom's most disturbing and infamous serial killer cases.
Yeah, this is, it's definitely a heavy one to dive into.
It really is. And I want you to just picture the scene for a moment. It's the early 1960s working-class Manchester.
Right.
It's a time and a place where you could, let your children play safely in the streets until dusk. Doors were left unlocked.
People just looked out for each other.
Exactly. You would have been completely oblivious to the terrifying reality that two seemingly ordinary people driving around your neighborhood were actively hunting.
And the mission of our deep dive tonight is to really dissect that chilling psychological partnership between those two people.
Brady and Myra Hindley.
Right, forever known as the Moor's murderers. We're going to examine the absolute bedrock of their relationship, how their shared obsession with control escalated into this reign of terror.
And obviously the mechanisms of their ultimate downfall.
Because they did build this localized empire of fear, but it was eventually undone by their own towering arrogance and, honestly, a trail of truly gruesome evidence.
I always struggle with, where to even begin with cases that reach this level of infamy. I mean, monsters aren't just born in a vacuum, right?
No, absolutely not. There has to be a foundation.
Yeah, a starting point where the cracks first begin to show.
Well, we really have to look at their separate, deeply troubled beginnings to understand that. I mean, Ian Brady was born in Glasgow to an unmarried teen mother.
So a rough start right from the jump.
Very rough. From the moment he entered the world, he experienced rejection. He was immediately passed into foster care.
And the early warning signs with him were pretty severe, weren't they?
Oh, incredibly severe. As a child, he exhibited extreme violent tendencies, like torturing animals, stoning dogs.
Which is such a classic red flag.
Yeah, there are even accounts of him burning a cat alive, though he would, spend years denying those specific acts to psychiatrists later on.
Right. And then he eventually moved to Manchester.
He did, yeah, to live with his birth mother and her new husband. But the damage to his empathy centers was already done by then.
And Myra Hindley grew up in that very same city, but her trauma was rooted completely in the home.
Exactly. Her father was violently abusive and a very heavy alcoholic.
That just paints a picture of a house where violence is essentially the everyday language.
He essentially taught her to solve every single problem with her fists. Like, he actually forced her to physically fight a local boy who had scratched her.
Wait, he forced her to fight back?
Yeah. She later wrote that at just 8 years old, she had scored her first victory by beating this boy.
Wow, at 8.
And the trauma just compounded. When she was 15, a close friend of hers drowned in a local reservoir.
Oh, that's awful.
She carried this immense guilt, basically blaming herself for his death. And that pushed her into this brief but incredibly intense period of devout Catholic conversion.
She was desperately looking for something to anchor her.
Exactly, she was totally adrift.
So you have these two very fractured people navigating the same city. You've got Brady, who possesses this deep-seated need to control and hurt.
Right.
And Hindley, who has been conditioned by trauma and is desperately searching for some kind of direction. How do these two volatile paths actually cross?
Well, the collision happened in 1961. She was working as a typist at Millward's Merchandising, which was a chemical distribution company.
And Brady worked there too.
Yeah, he was a stock clerk. And the infatuation on Hindley's end was just instantaneous.
Why? What drew her to him?
Brady cultivated this aura of being utterly aloof. He rode a motorcycle, he kept to himself, and he immersed himself in literature that, well, most people would totally recoil from.
Like what kind of literature?
He devoured books about Nazi atrocities. He admired the Marquis de Sade.
The 18th century nobleman, right.
Yeah.
The guy whose brand of cruelty literally gave us the word sadism.
Exactly, that's him. And Brady was completely obsessed with Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, focusing intensely on this idea of the extraordinary man who's just above the law.
Let me stop you there, because it's almost like looking at a volatile chemical reaction. It's so easy to just label them as evil and move on.
Sure.
But if you look closely, Brady's sadism and Hindley's desperate need for direction were like two inert chemicals that, when you mix them, created this explosive, deadly compound.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Like, if they hadn't met, would either of them have killed?
It's the ultimate question. Because Brady began applying pressure to her to see where her moral structural integrity would finally break.
How exactly did he go about breaking her down?
He was incredibly systematic about it. The whole psychological dynamic relied on isolation and boundary pushing. He actively tested her allegiance to see how far she would bend before snapping.
I mean, he actually drugged her at one point, right?
He did, yeah, just to test her compliance. And during their lunch breaks, he forced her to read that Nazi literature aloud to him.
Just slowly stripping away her old identity.
Right, pushing her to adopt this Aryan ideal. He had her bleach her hair stark blonde and wear this dark crimson lipstick.
He was essentially erasing the Myra Hindley that existed before him.
And building a loyal accomplice from the ground up, yeah.
But what was the ultimate goal of all this grooming? If he's rebuilding her, what is he preparing her for?
He was preparing her for his ultimate obsession, which was committing the perfect murder.
The perfect murder.
Yeah. Brady was heavily inspired by a novel called Compulsion. It's this fictionalized account of the Leopold and Loeb case in America.
Oh, right. The two wealthy, highly intelligent young men who murdered a boy in the 1920s.
Exactly. They did it simply to prove they possessed the intellect to outsmart the law. And Brady wanted to replicate that.
He wanted that godlike sensation of taking a human life.
Taking a life and watching the world scramble while he walked away completely untouched.
I really have to push back on that logic, though. I mean, Leopold and Loeb were wealthy elites who thought their money and education made them untouchable. Ian Brady is a stock clerk in working-class Manchester. How does he bridge that gap in his own mind? Does he actually think he's a criminal mastermind? Or is this just pure, unfiltered ego masking deep insecurities?
Oh, it's the absolute definition of a malignant ego. The lack of wealth and status in his real life is exactly why he needed to commit the perfect murder.
It was overcompensation.
Completely. Taking a life was his shortcut to feeling superior to the police, to his neighbors, to the entire society that he felt had overlooked him.
And Myra Hindley was the tool he needed to execute that vision. But I think it's important to point out she wasn't just some passive brainwashed victim in the background.
No, not at all. Once the conditioning took hold, she took highly active logistical steps.
Like joining a shooting club to learn how to handle firearms, right?
Yeah, she joined the club, she bought the guns, she learned to drive, she rented the vans they would eventually use. She basically became the logistics manager for their dark fantasies.
So they have the ideology, they have the weapons, and they have the transport. What is the catalyst that finally pushes them from role-playing these grim fantasies into taking actual human life?
The transition into action happened on July 12, 1963. They were driving around the neighborhood in a rented van.
Looking for a target.
Yeah. Brady, who was following behind on his motorcycle, spotted a target and signaled for Hindley to stop.
Who was the target?
A 16-year-old girl named Pauline Reed. She was actually a neighbor of Hindley's mother.
Oh, wow. So they knew each other.
Yes. She was just walking down the street on her way to the local dance.
Put yourself in the shoes of a 16-year-old girl in the 60s. A van pulls up, but you don't panic because the driver isn't a menacing stranger.
Exactly.
It's a young woman you recognize from your own street. What was the tactic they used to get her into the vehicle?
It was brilliantly deceptive in its simplicity. Hindley rolls down the window and asks Pauline for a favor.
Just a simple favor.
She tells her she lost an expensive glove out on Saddleworth Moor and asks if Pauline would mind coming along to help her find it.
And Pauline, wanting to be helpful to a neighbor, gets in the van.
Right. Once they reach the desolate expanse of the moor, Brady takes Pauline away over the hills, supposedly to search for this glove.
Then.
30 minutes later, he returns to the van alone. He shows Hindley the horrific aftermath he had slashed Pauline's throat.
God, the psychology of that luring tactic is just devastating. I mean, the concept of stranger danger existed back then, but it was generally aimed at men lurking in shadows.
Right, the boogeyman.
Exactly. A smiling, polite young woman asking for a small favor completely bypasses a victim's natural defense mechanisms. She was the ultimate camouflage.
She really was. Brady could never have gotten Pauline into a vehicle alone, but with Hindley, the trap was basically invisible until it slammed shut.
And that camouflage allowed them to operate with impunity.
It did, and the backdrop they chose for these crimes, Saddleworth Moor, provided the perfect concealment.
You really have to visualize Saddleworth Moor to understand the gravity of this case. It is this vast, bleak, unforgiving expanse of peat bogs, deep ravines, and jagged rocks just outside of Manchester.
It's very rugged.
The weather can turn violently quickly. It is cinematically beautiful, but it is incredibly harsh and isolated. It feels like the edge of the world.
Which makes it the perfect dumping ground for two people who think they are gods.
How did they operate out there?
Their operational method on the moor was highly calculated. They didn't just drive up there with a body and start digging.
They prepped the sites?
Yeah. Brady would ride out to the Moor days prior to the abductions and bury a spade in the peat. He would hide the tools in advance.
So they wouldn't be caught carrying shovels in the car.
Exactly. After the murders, they would bury the victims in shallow graves in the soft peat, but their twisted psychology didn't allow them to simply bury the victims and walk away.
This is the part that truly gets under my skin. Once the evidence is hidden, the goal of a criminal is usually to stay as far away from the crime scene as possible. What do they do instead?
They returned to the graves constantly. They would literally pack a thermos, drive out to the moors, and have picnics directly on top of the burial sites.
It's sickening.
And it gets worse. They took explicit, bizarre photographs of Hindley and her dog, a puppy named Puppet.
Posing against the skyline.
Posing, yeah, sometimes standing directly over the fresh graves of the children they had murdered.
It's just a mechanistic exertion of power. It wasn't just a sick scrapbook. By taking those photos, they were essentially building a private, open-air museum of their crimes.
That's exactly what it was.
They created a private monument where they could secretly visit to relive the thrill. They are sitting there drinking tea, knowing what is 6 feet under them, while the rest of the city is tearing itself apart, searching for these missing kids.
And that arrogance fueled an intense escalation. Over the next year, the body count rose. In November 1963, they utilized their luring tactic again.
Who was the next victim?
They approached a 12-year-old boy named John Kilbride at a local market. They offered him a ride home and the promise of a bottle of sherry.
And he vanished into the moors.
Yes. The following June, they abducted another 12-year-old boy, Keith Bennett. They were really refining their trap. But on Boxing Day of 1964, the pattern shattered in a terrifying way.
Okay, walk me through this shift, because anytime a serial killer changes their modus operandi, it usually signals a massive psychological break. What happened?
Well, they abducted a 10-year-old girl named Leslie Ann Downey from a fun fair. But this time, instead of driving her out to the sprawling, isolated safety of Saddleworth Moor,
They took her somewhere else?
they brought her directly to their council house at 16 Whortlebrick Avenue.
Wait, I struggle to wrap my head around this risk. Council houses in 1960s Britain were notorious for having paper-thin walls. You could hear your neighbors boiling a kettle.
It was a very busy housing estate.
So why would a killer duo, who had perfected a system of total isolation out on the moors, suddenly risk bringing a kidnapped child into a cramped, terraced neighborhood with families sitting right on the other side of the wall?
It perfectly illustrates the classic escalation of sadistic appetite. The quick, brutal kill on the desolate moor was no longer providing the high they required.
The thrill was fading.
Exactly. They needed the extended power trip of domestic torture. Bringing her into their own living room allowed them to prolong the terror, to exert total, unhurried control over the victim in their own environment.
Even with the neighbors right next door.
The staggering risk of being caught by a neighbor wasn't a deterrent. The risk itself was likely part of the arousal. Inside that house, Leslie Ann Downey was stripped, gagged, and forced to pose for horrific photographs.
Just awful.
And the most damning piece of evidence they created was a 16-minute audio tape recording her screams and her heartbreaking pleas for her mother.
The arrogance to record a murder in a terraced house. Hindley would later claim in her defense that she was completely unaware of the torture.
Yeah, she claimed she was upstairs running a bath.
Which is an absurd lie when you consider the proximity. But this need to push boundaries, to constantly raise the stakes, that's what inevitably leads to the critical error, right?
Yes, it does. The illusion of invincibility finally cracked on October 6, 1965. Brady lures a 17-year-old man named Edward Evans from a railway station back to the house on Whortlebrook Avenue.
But this murder isn't just about the two of them anymore.
No. Brady wants an audience, so he sends Hindley out to fetch her 17-year-old brother-in-law, David Smith.
Let's dissect the motivation here. Up until this night, their entire success, their ability to evade the largest manhunt in Manchester's history, relied entirely on absolute secrecy.
Total secrecy.
Bringing a 17-year-old kid into their inner sanctum is incredibly sloppy. Was Brady genuinely trying to recruit David Smith into some sort of murder cult? Or was his ego just so inflated at this point that he desperately needed an audience to witness his supposed genius?
The evidence points heavily toward an ego that had completely decoupled from reality. Brady had been subtly grooming Smith for months, actually.
Really?
Talking to him about hypothetical bank robberies, feeding him alcohol, trying to impress him with his dark philosophies. He believed he was an untouchable mastermind and just assumed Smith would recognize his dark grandeur.
But that blinding narcissism prevented Brady from understanding a basic human truth, which is that a normal person's reaction to witnessing a brutal murder isn't awe or worship. It is sheer, paralyzing horror.
Completely. Imagine the visceral panic David Smith must have felt. He walks into his sister-in-law's living room and watches Ian Brady bludgeon Edward Evans with a hatchet and then strangle him with an electrical cord.
He's 17 years old. He is acutely aware that if he shows an ounce of fear, he will be the next body on the floor.
Right, so purely out of self-preservation, he plays along.
He helps them wrap the body in plastic sheeting.
Yeah, he helps them move it to the spare bedroom. And then the agonizing wait. The second he is allowed to leave, he sprints home in the dark.
It's just blind terror.
He wakes up his wife, tells her what he just witnessed, and he is in such a state of primal terror that he arms himself with a screwdriver and a bread knife.
He waits until the sun comes up at 6 a.m., runs to a public phone box, and dials the police.
And when the police arrive at Wardlebrook Avenue, they know they are walking into a volatile situation, so they use a clever tactic to breach the house.
What do?
A detective puts on a bread delivery man's white coat over his uniform and knocks on the back door. When Hindley opens it, they push inside.
And what did they go find?
They find Brady calmly lying on a divan, writing a letter to his employer explaining that he won't be at work because he sprained his ankle.
The ankle he sprained while murdering a teenager in his living room.
Exactly the level of detachment we're dealing with here. The police demand the key to the locked spare bedroom.
And Brady refuses, obviously.
Right, so they force it open. Inside, they make the gruesome discovery of Edward Evans's bound body. The killing spree in Manchester was officially over.
But the investigation into what else these two had done was really just beginning. Because at this point, the police think they've caught two people who committed a single violent murder. How does this unravel into uncovering a serial killer network?
Well, while searching the house, investigators found an old notebook with the name John Kilbride written in it, which instantly connected the suspects to the massive missing children cases.
But there was a specific mechanism that truly blew the case wide open, wasn't there?
Yeah, it was the discovery of left luggage tickets. One of these tickets was chillingly hidden inside Myra Hindley's Catholic prayer book.
I have to ask about the logic of keeping those tickets. If you have evidence that can send you to prison for the rest of your life, why put it in a suitcase in a highly trafficked public railway station? And why keep the claimed tickets where they can be found?
It all comes back to that God complex we discussed with the perfect murder. Destroying the evidence would mean destroying his trophies.
Shame.
Storing the suitcases at Manchester Central Station meant he could walk past those lockers on a Tuesday morning, surrounded by hundreds of busy commuters, and know that he possessed the power of life and death locked in a box just feet away.
It was the ultimate thrill of hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. But those tickets led detectives straight to the suitcases. And inside, they found the undeniable mechanistic proof of their depravity.
What exactly was in there?
They found the pornographic photos of little Leslie Ann Downey. They found the harrowing 16-minute audio tape of her torture. And they found handwritten plans detailing exactly how they were going to dispose of Edward Evans's body on the moor.
But the real breakthrough in finding the missing children came from the photographs, right? The pictures of Hindley and her dog out on the moors.
Yes. Detectives realized these weren't just innocent holiday snaps. The framing was too deliberate. They were markers.
So what did the police do?
In an incredible feat of deductive police work, detectives literally took these photographs out onto the vast, miles-wide expanse of Saddleworth Moor.
Just physically walked it.
They painstakingly walked the terrain, holding the photos up to the horizon, trying to match the specific jagged skylines and the rock formations in the background of the pictures to the actual physical geography.
Put yourself in the boots of those detectives. Walking through freezing rain and sinking peat, holding a black and white photo, looking for a rock that matches a shadow. The dedication is astounding.
And that dedication paid off. By matching the terrain in one of the photos, they were led to a specific patch of disturbed peat. On October 16th, they found a protruding arm bone.
Oh, wow.
It was the grave of 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. And just days later, utilizing another photograph, they unearthed the body of 12-year-old John Kilbride. The evidence was irrefutable.
Which brings us to the courtroom. April 1966 at the Chester Assizes. The atmosphere surrounding this trial is hard to overstate. The public outrage was so visceral, so intense, that the courtroom dock had to be retrofitted with bulletproof glass just to protect Brady and Hindley from the gallery.
It was explosive. But the defining moment of that trial, the moment that stripped away any lingering facade, was the playing of that 16-minute audio tape.
I can't even imagine.
When the prosecution hit play, the entire room just froze. You had seasoned, hardened detectives literally crying in the courtroom.
And it completely destroyed Hindley's defense.
In an instant, any lie Hindley told about just running a bath completely fell apart. Yet on the stand, Brady maintained this pedantic arrogance, arguing with the prosecutor over minor semantics.
What about Hindley?
Hindley presented herself as entirely cold and impassive. She showed absolutely zero remorse.
The timing of their capture is an interesting historical footnote, too. The Murder Act of 1965 had suspended the death penalty in the UK just months prior to their trial.
That's right.
If they had been caught a year earlier, they would have hanged. Instead, both were handed multiple life sentences. The judge didn't mince words, describing them as two sadistic killers of the utmost depravity.
But a life sentence didn't mean the story was over. The ripples of this case lasted for decades.
Right, because there were still victims out there.
Exactly. The shadow of the Moors murders stretched long into the late 20th century. In the 1980s, police officially reopened the investigation to look into the remaining missing children, Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett.
And Hindley actually cooperated eventually.
Well, Hindley, who was desperately hoping to manipulate the system to improve her chances of parole, finally confessed to the remaining murders. Her confession effectively boxed Brady into a corner, forcing him to confess as well.
Did they actually help find the bodies?
In 1987, police actually flew Hindley back to Saddleworth Moor in a helicopter to help them search. Because she remembered seeing a specific rock formation silhouetted against the night sky when they buried her, police were finally able to locate Pauline Reed's body.
But they didn't find everyone.
No, the body of 12-year-old Keith Bennett was never found.
And that is arguably the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire tragedy. Winnie Johnson, Keith's mother, spent the rest of her life in absolute agony.
It's just devastating.
She mounted a relentless, decades-long campaign. She marched on the moors herself, rain or shine. She wrote impassioned letters, begging the killers for answers, pleading with Hindley to show a shred of humanity.
And she never got those answers.
No. Winnie Johnson died in 2012, never knowing where her son was buried. Why would they just tell her? If they were already serving life sentences, what did keeping that secret achieve?
It was Brady's final exertion of control. He hinted for years to journalists and police that he knew the exact coordinates.
So he remembered.
Withholding Keith's location wasn't a failure of memory, it was a weapon. By keeping that secret, Brady maintained a perverse, ongoing power over the victim's family, the police, and the public right up until his dying breath.
Just a final act of sadism.
Exactly. As long as he held the knowledge, he held the power.
The collateral damage of this case is immense. Let's look at David Smith. He was the young man whose sheer terror and bravery stopped the killing spree. He was entirely innocent.
Completely innocent.
He risked his life to go to the police, yet because he was related to Hindley by marriage and present at the final murder, the public wrongly reviled him as the third murderer.
They absolutely ruined him.
His home was vandalized, he was physically attacked in the street, and he lived a deeply tormented life. He was the one who stopped them, and society ruined his life for it.
And as for the killers themselves, they became enduring mythological symbols of evil in the UK. Hindley became the face of female evil, this Medusa-like figure whose stark mugshot was seared into the national consciousness.
Did she ever get out?
She repeatedly tried to manipulate the system for parole, but successive Home Secretaries, responding to massive public fury, ensured she never saw the outside world. She died in prison in 2002. Brady was diagnosed as a psychopath and moved to a high-security psychiatric hospital. He spent his final years engaging in a battle of wills with the authorities, trying to starve himself to death and fighting the system that kept force-feeding him. He finally died in 2017.
The impact of their crimes goes so far beyond the tragic loss of those 5 young lives. It leaves you with a chilling reality to consider.
It does.
The Moors murders permanently shattered the innocence of a nation. It took that inherent 1960s sense of community trust, the idea that you could leave your door unlocked and your kids out to play, and destroyed it forever.
Right.
When you hear a story like this, it forces you to ask yourself, how well do you actually know your neighbors? How many dark secrets are hidden just behind the curtains of the most unremarkable houses on your street?
It's a terrifying thought.
Thanks for listening to The Evidence Room. If you enjoyed this episode, like and subscribe for more true crime investigations from around the world. Remember, Some cases remain unsolved, but the evidence always tells the story.